Hello, this is the first video of Unit 2. In this unit, we're going to talk about how the United States looked at fixing the Articles of Confederation and eventually passing the Constitution, as well as the various amendments to expand individual rights and government power and change the structure of the living document. In this video, we are going to talk about the Constitutional Convention as well as the agreements and the compromises made to ratify the new government. So the Constitutional Convention is going to begin in May of 1787. Initially, the purpose was to come together and find a way to change the Articles of Confederation to make it more effective, or make the government more effective. 55 delegates are going to meet in Philadelphia, including many important people like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Gouverneur Morris, and James Madison. Madison's going to lay out what will be the basic plan of government, and Washington was the unanimous choice to preside over the convention to give it a form or a sense of legitimacy. And looking at the convention, each state would receive one vote with a simple majority needed. Delegates were sworn to secrecy to allow them to speak freely, and then all delegates favored a limited representative government with three branches: a legislative, executive, and a judicial. Once again, you can see Montesquieu creeping into the picture here with his separation of powers. Delegates wanted to limit states from coining their own money, and they also wanted to strengthen the national government. They realized that the government could not enforce its decisions or tax people under the Articles of Confederation. So you had multiple plans of government. The first is the Virginia Plan. It looked at a strong national government. You had a strong legislature with two chambers. You had a lower chamber that was chosen by the people, and the upper chamber was chosen by the lower chamber. The number of legislators would vary depending on state population, and the legislature could override any state laws that were seen as unconstitutional. They also favored a strong executive that was chosen by the national legislature, and a national judiciary chosen by the national legislature. So you can see with the Virginia Plan, the legislature was very important. And smaller states realized that they would not have as much power as the larger states. They wanted a less powerful national government with more power for the states. So the smaller states proposed the New Jersey Plan, where they wanted to keep two features of the Articles of Confederation. They wanted a unicameral legislature, because all the states had the same amount of power. And then they wanted a nation that would continue as a confederation of sovereign states. Okay, once again, the states would have more power than the national government, which favored smaller states. In the New Jersey Plan, Congress would have the ability to regulate trade and impose taxes, which it couldn't do under the Articles of Confederation. And the New Jersey Plan also favored a weaker executive with more than one person in power. Okay, this executive would still be elected by Congress or the legislature, and then the national judiciary would be chosen by the executive rather than Congress. So, to come into agreement, they formed the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise. The legislative branch would be bicameral. The lower house would be the House of Representatives, which was based on the population of each state. The Senate was the upper house, where you had two members from each state so that it was equal, and the smaller states had more power. Congress could impose taxes and spending. These laws would originate in the House of Representatives. Smaller states would be protected because of the Senate and equal representation. And then senators would be elected by the state legislators. In looking at the presidency, it was decided that the president would be decided or elected by the Electoral College. So voters from each state would select electors to choose the president. They agreed that the president would have a 4-year term. There were many proposals in terms of how long the president should be in power. Some said 2 years, some said 6. They also wanted a 7-year term. It also just varied depending on how many terms the president could run. And in the end, they decided that the president would serve a 4-year term, and they did not put a limit on the number of terms the president could run. Another issue that was dealt with during this constitutional convention was the idea of slavery, the topic of slavery. Southern states would not accept a new constitution if slavery was abolished. Because of this, the delegates pretty much chose to avoid the issue. They didn't even mention slavery in the Constitution. They used words like importation of people or persons held to service or labor. And most delegates from free states did not want slavery in the Constitution, but they recognized the need for a stronger national government, so they allowed for slavery to exist, simply in order to pass the new Constitution. One compromise they're going to come up with is the 3/5 compromise, which basically looked at how slaves should be counted in terms of population. And it was decided that slaves would represent 3/5 of a person. And looking at why that was, it's because 1 out of every 3 people living in the South were slaves. Southern states wanted slaves to count for not only representation purposes, but they didn't want them to count for taxing purposes. And northern states wanted slaves counted for tax purposes, but not representation purposes, because this would influence the balance of power regionally within the House of Representatives. So it was decided that 3/5 of all slaves would be accounted for representation and tax purposes. In other words, only 3 slaves would count for every 5 slaves. And this is going to be nullified by the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. Another issue they had to look at was commerce, and they also looked at the slave trade in regards to commerce as well. So Congress had the power to regulate interstate commerce, or commerce between states and commerce between different countries. It was decided that Congress could not ban the slave trade until 1808, or 20 years after the Constitution was put in place. And the moment that it was able to be banned, the slave trade was banned. Congress could not impose export taxes, and the U.S. is actually one of the few nations that still doesn't have export taxes today. So these were all various compromises and proposals for the new Constitution that was eventually ratified and still exists today.